Grant Cameron has been researching UFOs since 1975 and has been recognised as both the Leeds Conference International Researcher and UFO Congress Researcher of the Year. He spent decades watching and chronicling developments around extraterrestrial contact with several books to his credit. One of those is Managing Magic, the government's UFO disclosure plan. Grant's devoted about 3 decades of research into the role of the President of the United States in the UFO mystery, and most of that research can be found at presidentialufo.com. Let's welcome Grant. How are you doing today?
Just fantastic. Thanks for your interest in what I'm working on.
Yes, and we're going to be talking about Stanton Friedman today, the legendary researcher. Sadly passed away in May and left a huge legacy, and part of that legacy is a whole lot of research documents that he gathered over 61 years. So how many documents are we actually talking about?
I don't think anybody really has any idea. I looked through the first part of the collection that they had 22 archives boxes. That was only the stuff that they had in files in filing cabinets. The vast majority of the collection, maybe 90%, was never in files. It was in sort of piles of material all over the place. I photographed 6,000 pages of material, which would have been about maybe half of what was there, because he had a lot of stuff on. He worked in the 1980s as a physicist in Canada. He had a job, so there's a lot of that had to do with different physics jobs that he had, which had nothing to do with UFOs. So I was 6,000 pages, probably of 12,000 pages that I reviewed. The archivist, it told me 2 years. Now she's telling another researcher as much as 4 years, but 3 full-time archivists to put it all together.
Wow. Gee,
massive
really?
collection. Biggest, yeah, definitely the biggest UFO collection of all times.
Okay, so was there anything in particular that you were really interested in finding?
The material I was interested in finding when I went there was 2 things. As you know, or maybe you don't know, Stan was very much involved in the MJ-12 document in the 1980s. And I was researching at the same time, and I was interacting with Governor Bill Moore, who was on a team with Stanton Friedman and Jamie Chandray in the 1980s. And Stan maintained that the MJ-12 document was for real. I maintained it was a made-up document, but the MJ-12 was real, but the document was not real. There was actually 3,700 pages of MJ-12 documents that were released in the 80s and the 90s. So I was very interested in that, but I was interested in the back correspondence between Stanton Friedman, Bill Moore, Jamie Chandray, what was going on in the background. That was one of the things I spent a lot of time on. The other thing I was spending, I looked for and did find, and that is a case that I knew in late 1970s. I knew Stan was involved in. And that case involved a scramble of jets out of Cuba for a UFO that the National Security Agency had picked up the communications. And that file I did find, although the part of that file is missing because it appears that Stan did all this stuff by phone. And what I got an indication from Joanna, who is the archivist, is that a lot of Stan's phone calls were taped. So that is being processed, and I'll be going back to try to find, did Stan tape these phone calls about this Cuban jet intercept in 1967?
Yeah, I've always wondered, been wondering what's going to happen to all the files, given Stan's reputation. And do you think there's any danger that with the stuff he fought to expose, that there might be some unscrupulous people behind the scenes that would want to swoop in and grab those files?
Well, good luck. I mean, it's a massive collection. I mean, they would have to, I mean, if you've been in an archives, you realize that you have to sign out for the boxes. There was a couple of things that popped up that I told them to protect. One was and this happens with a lot of researchers, that you get a lot of material that comes to you and you basically don't have time to do it. It's not that you're not interested in the story, but you're just so busy with other stuff, you just stick it in a file. And the one thing that Stan did get was somebody had sent him a piece of the Roswell crash, and it said, "This is the piece from Roswell that I promised I would give you." And they just had it in a file. They had just had it, and I told them, "You better protect that piece of metal." And so they've got, I think, 6 different items at the present time. You got to remember, they're still processing this stuff. It'll take years to do, but where you need an actual archivist to actually go in the box with you to see this material. So that's the one thing that they had. The other thing that I think they're protecting is a photograph that was sent to Stan in 1984 from a cameraman from a TV studio who photographed these cows out in a field and these 7 UFOs over top of the cows. And that kind of stuff, I've sort of given them the instruction, because you got to realize the archives that this is in is not a UFO archives. They are provincial archives, almost like you would have a state archives where your birth certificates are held, death certificates, property sales, stuff like that. This is the first time they've ever done any sort of collection like this. And the archivist told me that she actually had to sort of fight to get this into the archives, because it's a lot of money. You consider 4 full-time archivists for 4 years. That's a lot of money.
Yeah.
And so that's not their type of collection. And the other thing is that Stan was not a Canadian citizen. So there was sort of a backlash as to why should we process some guy who was essentially an American. But he was so famous in Fredericton, New Brunswick, where this is happening, that they got it. So they're not putting this stuff online. In order to actually see the files, you have to go to the archives, you have to request a box, so you would have to know where the material is in the box. And as with all archives, you're not allowed to bring any paper in with you, you're not allowed to bring a pen in with you. There are a lot of restrictions inside an archives to protect documents, as there is at the National Archives and the presidential libraries. It's all the same thing. It's very hard to get stuff into the archives or out of the archives.
So given Stan's great reputation, was there any danger that those that he fought to expose would be the ones who might come in and swoop on his collection?
Okay, in terms of grabbing the material, there's a couple of things I don't think that will happen, and that is that the collection is very big. I don't think there's really anything that's going to be really detrimental in terms of proving that there's a UFO cover-up. And it's very hard inside an archives to actually move material out. You have to sign for boxes. They have video security. You're not allowed to bring a pen in. You're not allowed to bring a suitcase in or anything like that. So it's pretty restrictive in terms of that kind of stuff. There was a couple of items that I did mention to the archivist that they should protect. One was a letter that someone had sent to him that claimed to have a piece from the Roswell crash. And Stan, it appeared, had not done anything with it. He had just put this in a file. And so I said, that kind of stuff, you should gather that. And so there are, I think, 6 different items inside the archives that in order to see them, you need an archives person to be sitting there with you when you handle the material. So that kind of stuff. I don't think there's really anything major that I discovered that wouldn't, that people would be able to get. And it's still going to take years to do. I don't think Stan really had the smoking gun evidence, if that's what people are looking for.
As a world-renowned researcher yourself, Grant, going through Stan's work, was anything he did different to what you do? Was there a lot of similarities or not much at all?
Well, the one weird similarity was this idea that the archivist has stated that he was more of a piler than a filer. And he had 3 rooms full of stacked paper to the ceiling, and that a lot of stuff wasn't filed. And I noticed myself as well that you get sort of overwhelmed with the number of subjects you're working on. And I suddenly realized I had these stacks starting to pile up around the room. So that was one thing that was similar. I think in terms of what he was doing, it was basically like any other researcher. So people would put me the question like, well, did you find any pay slips from the CIA? All this kind of stuff. Was he a double agent? Was he working for the government and stuff? And I go, no, when I look at it, he's just like any other researcher, was going after the same sort of subjects, was making the same phone calls. Basically, I don't think very much different. It's just he had done it for 61 years, and he was the type of guy who didn't throw anything out, which I'm sort of like that as well. In fact, the archives at one point came to me with these little slips of paper, and she said, would you want me to, do I throw this stuff out? And I said, no, put it all in one box. And that was the
Mhm.
old idea. When you're a researcher, you put somebody's name on a piece of paper or a couple of ideas on a piece of paper. And there was like literally piles and piles and piles of these little pieces of paper. And I said, I would actually go through these little pieces of paper to look to see if there was something on there that rang a bell. But that was the kind of thing that I noticed. It was just massive amounts of material. And even though he was more focused on the research he was doing, he only had certain subjects he was interested. The problem with him is the same as the problem I have, is that if you sort of get any reputation as being sort of a lead researcher or something like that, everybody asks you about everything. So Stan, even though he didn't work on the alien autopsy or the Lazar thing, he would get questions, and
Mhm.
then he would have to know about everything because he had the vast majority of the collection, I think, is letters from people, ordinary people on the street writing to him about certain subjects. And Stan would take the time and he would actually write back to people and this sort of thing. So there's a lot of files on a lot of different subjects. And I found that very interesting, that I'm in the same sort of situation where people will write you, and it's not that the subject isn't interesting. It's just you don't have time to do everybody's story. Everybody thinks that you're going to research their story and do a book. So there were a lot of weird stories in the Stanton Friedman files that Stan never did investigate. But
Mhm.
he did have a lot of big investigations that he did. And the prime examples were the MJ-12. He spent a lot of time on that. The skeptics, Stan would fight with every skeptic that came along, debate them and stuff, which I don't do. I don't get into that. And the other thing he had was the Area 51 thing with the Bob Lazar thing. There were literally hundreds and hundreds of pages of material on that. He did a real deep dive investigation. He had the court file papers when the pandering charge came up, all these different things. He had done all the background stuff. And it was pretty impressive, the amount of material that he had, even though I would disagree with his assumption as to what happened at Area 51. It was really impressive to see these collections where he actually went after something. He was very meticulous. He would do a lot of phone calls, a lot of research, and he knew how to do it. He's a very good researcher.
Yeah. So you've mentioned some of the projects he was working on, but did he have a favorite? Was there something that he really wanted to sink his teeth into?
Well, I guess the favorite was the MJ-12. That was the concept where the idea is there's a group of guys that are in control of the whole thing, sort of like this the cabal that's running the whole show. And Stan got involved. It was actually kind of weird because this is the background stuff I was looking for. Is this document was leaked in 1984? It was first the MJ-12 word was starting to be leaked out in about 1980. And I've always said it's a slow drip disclosure, that they're putting out material and using plausible deniability. So they alter documents, they put it out where they can say these documents are phony, and they're putting it out. Now the big MJ-12 document, which I guess Stan probably spent his whole career trying to defend himself because people figured he had been taken and he was defending this document as being real, came out in December of 1984. But Stan actually did not see the document until it was actually made public in about May of 1987. So there was 3 years where he didn't see that document. And the thing was, he was asking for this document, but Bill Moore was saying to him, well, it's too unsafe to send you the document. You got to remember, this is before email. This is snail mail stuff, and he didn't want to send Stan this document. So the weird thing was this document that Stan basically, I think, spent the vast majority of his time defending, that he was right about the MJ-12 and the document was real. He didn't really see the document until it was too late, where he got stuck in it and he was defending it. I would say that was what he spent most of his time on. And the other thing was basically fighting with skeptics. So the famous Phil Klass from the Aviation Week and Space Technology, there is literally hundreds of pages of correspondence, snail mail correspondence going back and forth, where these guys are arguing about various subjects and like that. So those were the two main things that I think Stan was basically working on, was the skeptic thing of trying to hammer on people who really didn't know what they were talking about, and that flying saucers did exist. If you actually looked at the evidence and didn't ignore it, it was for real. And the fact that there was a control group that was running the whole show. But there, I think he sort of got backed into that corner where he had to defend the document and protect his reputation, whereas the vast majority of people believe the document was not real.
Yeah, I think it's more a case of trying to prove that the flying saucers aren't real. I mean, there's so much evidence that coming up with evidence that they aren't real is the tough thing. But the difference between skeptics and debunkers. I don't mind skeptics. Debunkers are what annoy me.
Yeah, Stan actually had some really interesting stuff. I mean, I've been doing some PowerPoint presentations where I go through some of the documents that I found, and he actually had little things that you'd hear in his lectures all the time. He had these little rules about skeptics. Don't bother me with the evidence. My mind is already made up, and all these little anecdotes that he had that have become famous because he used them almost every lecture. And when you look at what he was saying, it was actually the fact that the vast majority of people who went up against Stanton Friedman, whether it was Carl Sagan or whether it was Phil Klass or James Oberg or these people, it was really true because I had run up against these guys as well. And the fact is they really don't read the evidence. They basically, it's like a rational argument where I'm smart enough, I can just sort of wing it. I don't really need to see the evidence. It's just very common that this is not going to be real or whatever. But Stan, I mean, there's just massive amounts of time that he spent arguing with these people, debating these people at Oxford and different universities. And that sort of tied into Stan's life. I mean, when you look at the material he did, I show some of the itineraries of Stan's travel. It was unbelievable. And he was making some pretty good money. He was doing universities, which is a pretty high-end money thing. But his itinerary would be like 2 lectures on this day, fly to this city, do another lecture, fly to this city. And he was doing this for like decades and decades. I was stunned because I know I can go on the road, I can do 2 lectures. And after that, it's like, oh man, get me home. It's like, I could not believe the amount of material that he produced. And in light of the fact that he was traveling most of the time, he would say to people, he would say, this is my job. I mean, I've got to pay for my family. I got to, pay the bills and stuff like that. So he did it full time, but it was amazing because I know when I'm on the road, I don't really get a lot of stuff done, but Stan was able to meticulously work at stuff, answer phone calls, go through all this material. I was pretty impressed with what I saw, even though it was very unorganized, that he'd sort of lost control of the files after a while, that there was just so much material that he was no longer filing this stuff. He was just sort of stacking it. And yet, I guess he would know where it was. I've run up against it because I used to run buildings at the university, and I ran up against professors that were like that, who had, like everything. You couldn't move in their office. That's what apparently was Stan's, that you could go into any of the 3 rooms and you could not move in the room. You could literally not turn around. There was that much material in the room, but yet he would know where everything was. And that was pretty amazing that he was able to pull this material, because I didn't know until the archives pointed out the fact that almost none of the stuff was in files.
Yeah, there's no doubt about his passion. One more on Stan, Grant. How did he get on with other researchers? Did he have people that he confided in?
Yes, that was he would never really publicly go against other researchers. He was very much against Bob Lazar. He would mostly fight with the skeptics. He would always do the gray basket thing. If it was a controversial subject where he really didn't agree with someone, he would say, okay, that's in my gray basket. It's not a white basket or black, it's a gray basket, to sort of avoid the controversy. So he really didn't fight with a lot of researchers. He just fought with the skeptics who were outside the field. And a lot of times we'd be in situations where there would be panels and stuff, and you'd get into the secret space program, and Stan would just sit there very quietly and not say anything. So I was pretty good in that way of not criticizing other researchers or getting into fights with other researchers, unless it was the Area 51 thing, which he was really upset about, that people were backing that. And the alien autopsy, he was very much against the alien autopsy.
Mm-hmm.